Welcome to 42 Bedford Row Animal Welfare webinar. We are very lucky today to have Edie Bowles with us. Edie, as she will no doubt tell us, is one of the co-founders of the first animal welfare specific law firm, Advocates for Animals, and also a co-founder of a related charity. So she really is an expert, and will be not only introducing Edie and listening to what she has to say about where we are generally in terms of animal welfare, but we'll be focusing, as the title of this talk suggests, this discussion suggests, the enforcement problem. For those of you that are familiar with this area, we're not planning to go into all the legal details of regulations, laws, etc., but really just to try to give a feel for the lie of the land as it stands in terms of broadly what the legislation is and what it should be doing, but more importantly, from our point of view, what isn't happening in terms of animal welfare, which should be happening. But before we kick off with that, Edie, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me, and hello, everyone.
You're welcome. And I think before I ask you a little bit about your background, how you came to be doing this work, congratulations on your visit to 10 Downing Street last week.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's very exciting. First time I've ever been to 10 Downing Street, and right. I was there to talk, to hand in a petition to do with enforcement. So very timely with today's discussion.
And I think that was in handing in a petition. Was it 120,000 names initially, at least? And money. And when you say enforcement, that's directly what I think we're talking about today. But before we get to that, it would be helpful, I think, for people, both out of general interest and also because, certainly from my point of view, it's inspiring to hear the stories of people who have become involved in something they believe in. And we as lawyers, to some extent, do that, but often we don't. We often end up in areas that we sort of just find our way to by chance. So in your sense, you got to something that you obviously feel very strongly about, passionately about. Could you give us a little sense of the route by which you got there?
Yeah, of course. And it's interesting you say that, people find themselves where they end up by chance, because in many ways that's also factored into how I've ended up here, albeit I got very lucky because by chance I'm now in a field that I care deeply about. So I think luck and some key decisions along the way, I suppose, got me here. I studied law like I imagine most lawyers did, not really thinking about animal law as a subject. It wasn't really on my radar as I was studying law. I did always, I cared about animals back then. I've always deeply cared about animals, but I really just didn't consider it as a potential practice. And so I kind of went through my studies, did I left after university. I didn't go straight into my LPC. I worked actually in television for a few years as a runner and then a researcher, then eventually found my way back to law. And at this point, it just dawned on me that animal law might be a thing. So I think I Googled Animal Law UK, and ALAW, the UK Centre for Animal Law, came up. And at that point, I got involved with ALAW and set up the nationwide student group at ALAW whilst in my LPC, and then for some time afterwards. I still at that stage just thought that it'd be something I did on the side. I didn't think it was something you could practice in. I thought that the way it'd work is I would do a more conventional area of law and then do the thing I'm passionate about on the side. So I did that for a while. I practiced intellectual property law for a while whilst volunteering with ALAW. Then an opportunity came up at Cruelty Free International, which is an anti-animal testing charity. And what was really unique about this role, so it was an in-house solicitor role, but what was quite unique is that rather than it being that kind of general counsel stuff, employment, charity law, and the stuff you usually find in those roles, it was actually more to do with the application of animal law, looking at ways that the law can be used to help Cruelty Free International in their objectives. So, in that role, I learned how to advise on undercover investigations, how to advise on certain regulatory stuff to do with chemical testing, public law stuff. And it really was the kind of prototype for what later became the law firm that I now run. So whilst there, I worked with the co-founder of the law firm, David Thomas, and we realized that, there were more organizations out there that needed this service. People were coming to us on a kind of an ad hoc basis asking for advice. And it occurred to us that actually what we were doing at Cruelty Free International could be replicated for others. And so we took that leap of faith, set up Advocates for Animals, which, as you said, is the first UK animal protection law firm. And yes, I've been now advising most animal protection groups and individuals in England and Wales for quite some time, for about 4.5 years.
Right. And in terms of people from the outside understanding this, a lot of people will have a general awareness that there's animal welfare issues, and it comes to the fore sometimes with what might be broadly described as activists. Where does your firm and where does the charity you're involved in, where does that stand in terms of activism as opposed to being a law firm?
Really great question, and something that we have to grapple with, of course, because whilst we have our deep kind of passion and commitment to animal protection, that's not our role. We're very clear, as you know, when we've got our Advocates for Animals hat on, that we're lawyers, we're a law firm, we offer objective advice and would never, advise any client to bring forward a meritless claim. So in terms of where our line is, we remain very much the lawyers. However, our clients are activists and campaigners, so there is that separation.
Right. And again, just to sort of fit the pieces together, as it were, you're obviously a co-founder of the Animal Law Foundation, a charity. And so what's the purpose of that, and how does that relate to your legal work?
Yeah, so you're right, that is a bit different. So whilst Advocates for Animals is a law firm and we don't obviously bring our own cases, we act on behalf of others. Whilst doing the work at Advocates for Animals, the law firm, we'd often identify potential legal issues. We do these big research projects for some of our clients looking into areas of law, and occasionally we will come across something where we think the law is being neglected, that there's a potential breach of law, be it on an isolated issue or a systemic basis. And we'll present this to a client and say, look, there's a potential breach here. And sometimes a client's not able to take that forward, maybe, for financial reasons, or possibly just because it doesn't fit within their campaigning objectives at that time. Yeah. So prior to this charity that I've just set up, these potential cases were just falling away. And it dawned on me that a vehicle was needed to be able to dedicate resources to looking at these potential breaches of law. The reason why this is happening on such a systemic basis, why there are potential breaches of law, is because prior to Advocates for Animals, there really wasn't anyone spending their full-time job looking into this stuff. So it makes sense that the more people looking into it, the more you're going to uncover. And so Animal Law Foundation is really set up to do that, and to just make sure, it's a very simple remit, really. It's just to make sure that the law that applies to animals, or is given to animals, the protections that are given to animals under the law, is applied in practice. And I think everyone would support that idea.
And before we move to look a little bit more at the legislation and, more importantly, the enforcement or lack of enforcement of that, could you give us just an idea of the type of cases you're taking on, the kind of issues you're dealing with from a legal perspective within your law firm?
Yeah, of course. So the range, like the wide range of of animal law cases that you can imagine. Essentially, what makes animal law really interesting is that, unlike human law, the law that applies to animals really depends on the circumstances they find themselves in. So if an animal is in a lab, there'll be a legal framework that applies to that. If an animal is on a farm, there'll be a legal framework that applies to that. An animal in the wild, all of these have separate regulatory systems. And the work that we do at Advocates for Animals covers that whole range. So in terms of some examples of what I'm currently working on, I've recently advised on a few undercover investigations, mostly on farms. I have recently been involved in a judicial review challenging the use of fast-growing chickens bred for meat. For those of you who don't know, chickens have been selectively bred to reach slaughter weight in an extremely short period of time, and as a result of that, they suffer from a range of health and welfare issues. We challenged that on behalf of a client by way of judicial review. Unfortunately, we were unsuccessful. However, we are in the process of lodging an appeal. So there's some of the kind of farmed animal, that's some of the farmed animal work that I've been doing. I've also been involved in a judicial review relating to grey squirrels. So I know grey squirrels aren't very popular. However, the kind of consequences of that are that grey squirrels aren't treated very well. And so, rescue centres that would ordinarily be able to take injured squirrels in, rehabilitate them, and then release them into the wild, are no longer able to do that due to invasive species legislation. And this is really crippling rescue centres. And, you know, we're talking about a small number of squirrels here, nothing that's going to really change the environmental landscape. But unfortunately, the invasive species legislation is very rigid. And so we're trying to overcome that. That's a very interesting case. Yeah, and much more, but just off the top of my head, I'm struggling to think of it.
Okay, no, well, as I say, we're really trying to look at, I mean, there's a huge range. I mean, as you say, we're not going to get into the weeds of all this. I mean, we would be here for weeks, but we were going to try and have a discussion really about enforcement, and perhaps we may focus on the landscape when it comes to farms particularly, and also slaughterhouses, that kind of thing. So just to give a very broad background in a few sentences, what's the main legislation that people will be considering if this is the background to these kind of issues?
Yeah, so the main piece of legislation is the Animal Welfare Act that kind of underpins most pieces of legislation where animals are under the control of humans. That's a very kind of simple way of explaining it. It's more nuanced than that, but that's essentially the Animal Welfare Act. The Animal Welfare Act also has the power to create regulations that are more specific to certain, you know, practices or certain industries, and has done so, you know, for various industries, including farmed animals. So under the Animal Welfare Act, there's a separate set of regulations called the Welfare of Farmed Animals Regulations, and that governs the majority of farmed animals in the UK. There's also separate regulations about licensing certain activities, you know, like puppy breeding and hiring out horses and kennels and various other pieces of legislation. And again, that flows from the Animal Welfare Act.
I mean, is it fair to say, without getting too boring about the legislation, that in one sense we have codified one way or another most activities in relation to animals, that there are rules there, whether it's regulations or primary legislation? The difficulty we face when we look at this is not that we can't find a rule to protect an animal. We can nearly always find something that says you should or shouldn't do this, or you should be nice to animals, or you should take care to ensure things. The problem is that it's not being enforced. Is that fair as a simple...
I think that is exactly, the long and the short of it. And to be honest, it kind of goes back to what I was saying about the need for organisations like the Animal Law Foundation that are, you know, trying to change that. But essentially, yes, I mean, the public cares about animal welfare. You know, the public wants, you know, these protections to be in place and these protections to be enforced. Yet what we're seeing are, you know, there's huge campaigning efforts, huge lobbying efforts to get these bills through Parliament. Everyone feels that this is great, this is a done job. And actually it's not. What tends to happen is these laws just kind of fall away, and people kind of even forget that they have responsibility over these pieces of legislation. So yeah, it's not a good situation.
And before we talk about directly about the lack of enforcement, is it possible to paint a clear picture as to how it's supposed to work? So we've got the laws, and on the ground we're supposed to have monitoring and potentially inspections. And as I understand it, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, there are a plethora of agencies, bodies, public bodies that, in theory at least, have some level of responsibility, and they range all the way from DEFRA as a main government department through agencies like AFA, the Animal Plant and Health Agency, and then it divides up into the CPS, the police, sometimes the RSPCA, sometimes the Food Standards Agency, a whole range of bodies and local authorities on top of that, and their various subdivisions within them, who may or may not have responsibility for the elements of the Act which are necessary before you get to the point of enforcement. So, I mean, it seems to me, at least, as someone coming into this fairly fresh, that it's complicated, tangled, and at times hard to know, in fact, who's supposed to be doing what. How would you say about that?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of bodies where farmed animals are concerned. There's a lot of bodies involved in terms of the regulation of how they're treated at various stages, and a lot of overlap as well, actually. I don't know. I don't have any data or information on on whether that overlap or whether that kind of complicated structure is causing these issues. I suppose it's intuitive to suggest that it is causing some of the issues. The fact that it's incredibly complicated, I suppose it's quite difficult to be able to prove that. But what I do have data on is the fact that enforcement is incredibly low. throughout
Yes.
all of those bodies. So something's going on, and that's one plausible theory. Another plausible theory is that these bodies are under-resourced, and another plausible theory is that the animal welfare is deprioritized. So yes, I think it is incredibly complicated. How it's supposed to work is pretty much kind of how you summarized it then. On farms, you have the Animal Plant and Health Agency and local authorities that should be inspecting farms. If there are any breaches, again, it could be one of those bodies that enforces. Most often it should be the local authority that enforces. The central government can get involved with certain issues depending on, whether it's a nationwide issue or whether it's particularly public, whether it has particular public importance. You then have the Food Standard Agency that, should be inspecting welfare in slaughterhouses, and again bringing action if there are any breaches of welfare law in slaughterhouses. Then you have the Crown Prosecution Service, where these cases might get referred to if a prosecution is brought by, for example, the Food Standard Agency or perhaps the Animal Plant and Health Agency. So there's a lot of players involved. It's incredibly complicated.
So we have what might be called the public bodies. We did, I think, and again, at a sort of relatively superficial level, have the involvement of the RSPCA for some time, but I think their involvement became controversial. There were various sort of news stories about them, certainly a few years ago. My understanding is at least some of their work was supposed to be transferred to the CPS, who we know are notoriously under-resourced and overburdened, and things get delayed. What's your understanding or experience of the CPS and their effectiveness in terms of actually bringing and prosecuting complaints in respect of animal welfare?
Yeah, so my understanding with the RSPCA in this field, when it comes to farmed animals, is that they haven't actually been involved in the enforcement of farmed animal welfare law for some time. However, they are obviously still the biggest prosecutor for other areas that affect animals, primarily companion animals, I suppose. There's talk of them handing that role over, as you've just said, to the Crown Prosecution Service. However, they have said that they won't do that until they're satisfied that the Crown Prosecution Service is able to take these cases on. So that provides some comfort. I suppose I'm torn, because on the one hand, the RSPCA do a great job. They've got a very high success rate. They're the biggest private prosecutor in the country. Without them involved, what happens, I suppose? So on the one hand, that's how I feel about that. However, I do think it's indicative of the way animal law is treated, and again, why we see the enforcement problem. The very fact that the enforcement of animal protection law has been left to a charity says all you need to know. It should be dealt with by the state. The state should have resources in place to be able to make sure that the laws that it passes through Parliament can be enforced in practice.
Now, if the state was going to do it, what the state needs to have is an effective means of establishing whether its laws, as you rightly say, the state's laws are being adhered to, or whether they're being broken. One of the big issues when one looks at just the headline figures is the lack of inspection. In theory, how is, for example, if we took a farm, what should provoke an inspection to take place, and what's actually happening on the ground now?
Yeah, so this is an interesting point, because there's actually some confusion as to what's actually required in practice. There is an argument that actually inspections should take place on certain farms on an annual basis. However, we know that the system in place is very much risk-based. So this means if a farm is already on the radar of the public body, then that might make it more likely to be inspected. Similarly, if a member of the public sees something happen on a farm and then reports it, that should result in inspection, or if an undercover investigation takes place. So it's very much kind of a risk-based inspection regime, depending on the issues that are flagged to the relevant public body. Now, of course, there's an obvious issue with this. If no one's witnessing the wrongdoing, and lots of these practices are happening behind closed doors in barns, and if no one's there to kind of flag it to the relevant public body, then these farms may never enter the purview of a risk-based inspection regime.
And again, it looks as if, from again a sort of survey of the data, that there's a very uneven provision of inspectors across the country, and we've got about 300,000 farms, I think, relevant farms that we're talking about in the UK. But in some local authorities, it seems they've got one or sometimes no full-time inspectors. Is that your understanding?
That is my understanding, and I've just realised that your knowledge of the enforcement report that I helped draft is far more up to date, like far more fresh than mine. I wrote that last year, and you're saying you're saying statistics that I
Forgive me, I'm being very dull.
No, it's not that. It's more that it's not fresh. But you're absolutely right. That is the way it works. So there's no requirement for for a local authority to employ an inspector. They might share one amongst several local authorities. So it really does depend. It very much is dependent on the local authority.
Even if we were to put that to one side and say, well, there is a shortage of resources, there seems to be a shortage of resources in all areas of public life in many ways, and this is one of them, and it will depend therefore on the priority given to that. But even where interested parties or concerned individuals find out or suspect and therefore make a referral to a local authority, the figures seem to suggest that a very small percentage of those reports, if you like, or complaints, however one wants to put them, result in any prosecution, if so, and certainly in a conviction.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a sense of what's happening there, and why there is such a sort of, if you like, almost pathetic response to people, if you like, doing the state's job, taking it upon themselves to find out information, and then virtually nothing happening?
I know. And to be honest, it's, I'm sure that there's a way that can be explained away, in terms of, we spoke to the farm and we decided that they would resolve XYZ, and that's why we didn't bring a prosecution. I'm sure that there are loads of those excuses doing the rounds. However, I've been involved in undercover investigations now for a while, and advising groups on undercover investigations and then reviewing footage after they've conducted the undercover investigation. And in all cases, there are always some substandard practices on farms, quite often illegal practices, and quite often the most shocking cruelty you'll ever see. That, these farms are not chosen. They often are, they're most often random, and time and time again you see shocking cruelty. In these cases, you'll send this footage to the relevant public body, and again, no prosecution will be brought. So yes, you've mentioned the data, the fact that there are low prosecutions, and I can paint that picture to tell you that it's certainly not to do with there not being the evidence, because I've seen evidence handed to public bodies and nothing happened.
To what extent is there a route and as you rightly say, there's plenty of information you can get to look at it online, of undercover videos, which they speak for themselves. You don't have to be an expert almost, but if you were then to compare that with what the law says should be the case, it's quite clear that there are certainly prima facie breaches of these, of all sorts of things, graphic, and they're really quite troubling to watch. If the state or the designated bodies do not seek to prosecute, are there any other routes in terms of private prosecutions in which these things can be dealt with? Absolutely.
Private prosecutions are very, valid option in those circumstances. And in fact, I'm involved in 2 private prosecutions at the moment to do with undercover investigations. Actually, I had to check myself, but yes, to do with undercover investigations, where the public bodies haven't been interested in prosecuting. So it's absolutely an option. I suppose there are issues attached to it. The issues are they don't, a private prosecutor doesn't have the same powers as, as a public prosecutor will have in terms of interviews and evidence gathering. And so there's they're limited with that evidence that they've already gathered. Also, it's expensive to fund something yourself. It takes up time and resources. So there are difficulties attached, but it's absolutely a valid way forward if no one else is pursuing it.
So carrying on, the other source of information you've mentioned a number of times are undercover operations, And how is it that you and your firm are involved in these, and what are the broad legal parameters of being involved in some sort of undercover operation or using that evidence?
Yeah, so we're not the ones conducting the undercover investigation, but of course lots of our clients will want to carry out undercover investigations. So we simply, our role from the outset isn't to be involved in any way other than say, look, here's the risks with doing something of this nature. That's pretty much our only involvement at the outset. However, these clients then tend to come back to us with the footage that they've gathered, and at that point we'll review the footage, and where we feel that there have been legal breaches, we'll kind of assist them in terms of identifying what those are, approaching the relevant public bodies, and considering options if action's not taken.
Yes. You mentioned that some of, and as we know, some of the footage from that, an awful lot of it seems to be explicit and clear and utterly convincing as to the kind of unacceptable and illegal behavior, probably very likely, that's going on. In your experience, when a prosecuting authority doesn't choose to do anything with it, are reasons given? Are you getting a feel for what it is that's preventing that action taking place?
Yeah, a whole range of reasons are given. Sometimes it's kind of as shocking. Sometimes it's as shocking as just being ignored. But sometimes it's you're dismissed and you get a letter back saying we've done an inspection on that farm and it's fine. And you'll have footage that's just from the previous month or something where it's quite clearly not fine, and it's quite clearly a systemic problem. It's not just a one-off situation, it's something that's obviously pervasive throughout the whole farm. So quite often that's an excuse that they've done an inspection. Now remember, those inspections tend to be announced as well, so of course it's not hard for an organization to tidy up their act for one morning. So that tends to be an excuse you see. Sometimes they might determine, I suppose, it's not in the public interest to prosecute, or they might determine that they don't agree that there have been breaches of law. So yeah, a whole range of reasons as to why something wouldn't be pursued.
Okay. It's quite clear that there is a dramatic problem, and as I say, your report highlights that without any equivocation, and very clearly and very well evidenced. In terms of where we are now then and what the responses are, first of all, sort of from a governmental response, is there a sense in which they are trying to address this? Are there moves to look at enforcement in a different way or ensure compliance in other ways now?
So yes, I've heard through the grapevine that enforcement's something that is being considered. So that's promising and that's exciting. They've also recently launched a consultation on penalty notices, which will be another kind of tool in the toolbox, to prevent wrongdoing. But yeah, I think some real meaningful change is needed. This is obviously something that isn't going to be solved overnight, and it's something that desperately needs to be solved. So I'm glad to hear that they're considering this, but we need to see the action.
Yeah. Okay. In terms then of us, and I'll break us into two categories: us as lawyers and us as individuals. The danger is we look at this situation and feel it's so bleak, and the government clearly don't regard this as a priority, in the same way, in many ways, as we've only heard today, the threat to ditch commitments on other environmental things. So that a lot of these issues, which in many ways are interrelated, are simply not being prioritized. And it would be easy to get very downcast about all these kind of things. But first, as lawyers, what can we do? Anyone that's interested, even if it's not as a full-time job, of course, as a full-time job, great. But even not, what can we as lawyers get involved in to address these things?
Yeah, as lawyers, we have a very unique ability to be able to understand legislation. I think we take it for granted that we can do that, because actually when other people are reading legislation, it's not intuitive. There'll be other skills, but reading legislation is something you learn to do. And I think that having that unique skill set, I think we should use it. We should be able to digest that legislation and be able to communicate it in as straightforward a way as possible to as large an audience as possible, just to keep people informed. And of course, getting involved in the legal action and trying to improve things, you know, through the courts, through pressure, you know, on the relevant bodies that aren't doing what they should be doing. So I think that lawyers can play a very unique role in improving the situation for animals. It's not the only role. Campaigning's a role, you know, lobbying Parliament is a role, but I think lawyers have a really unique role to play as well. And yeah, we need more of them.
And as lawyers, although some people might disagree, you're also human and individuals. What can we as individuals do as well? If someone feels, well, I'm listening to this, I don't feel I have particularly the legal skills that are adaptable to this, or if I do, I don't have the time. But what as an individual would you hope people might consider doing?
Yeah, so there's plenty that individuals can be doing. You know, all of our clients, you know, all of the organizations that we work with rely so heavily on the support of individuals. So, you know, helping share their petitions, or, you know, signing up to certain campaigns, all of that stuff, you know, goes really far. That 10 Downing Street petition that you mentioned at the beginning, 120,000 plus signatures, that really shows how much people care about this issue. You know, each individual signing that matters and has improved things. There's also just, you know, I also just think it's really useful when individuals, you know, read up on this stuff and inform themselves of the situation, because I think once you really fully kind of appreciate the framework that animals operate in and the, you know, the issues that we have to confront, you're in a far better position to be able to challenge those issues. So really just staying as kind of educated as possible on the problems.
I think certainly what I did when I started to become interested is sign up to a few newsletters and email rounds, which actually are very accessible, quick, brief updates, and where there are things that can be signed or done, or things that we can start to think about in a different way, they're very clearly signposted in those. So presumably that would be another route for people to make it easy for themselves to get involved.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I love an easy to read digest. So,
Exactly.
So anything like that.
Edie, it's been really excellent having you talk to us and give us the benefit of your experience. I know you're incredibly busy this week and you've rushed around and that you fitted us in, so we're very grateful. And if people do have questions, they can come through to us by email or through the question. I don't think there are any for now. But as I say, thank you very much again. And maybe in the future, we'll be able to get you back to give us an update on how things are going in the world of animal welfare. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me, and have a lovely evening, everyone.
Yeah, bye-bye.